Welcome Historical Society, and I want to welcome you all, especially all you marshals, to this third talk in our spring speaker series. I apologize for this being such a small room. Donia and Ken are probably going to do this again because we've been turning people away. But thank you for being here. And before they start, I just want to remind you of two upcoming events that the Historical Society is sponsoring. The first runs May 6th through May 20th. It's called If This House Could Talk. You are invited to tour around town at your leisure to view 32 different storyboards that owners of homes and businesses have created. And it's a super fun event, and the boards are just wonderful. And they're all different because it's just people's creativity. The second one is about a month from now, Saturday, May 20th. Robert Seidler will be talking about the history of sock chopping. So those are the things I wanted to remind you of. And then there are books and mugs for sale back on the piano. There's wine, lemonade, tea, snacks, etc. in the back room, which you're welcome to when this is over. Restroom in the back. And so for today's talk about the Marshall Brothers, without whom this city would not be what it is today. You will be just blown away by what they did for this city. The talk is given by Ken Tucker and Donia Smith. Donia is the great-granddaughter of Will Lenhoff Marshall. Ken Tucker is the great-grandson of Will's brother John Marshall. Donia lives here in Apalachia with her husband George, who's at the computer, and we thank him very much for all his technological know-how. And Ken lives in Tallahassee, but he has a home on St. George Island. They both have deep roots in this town, and they have put together a fascinating presentation for you, so I hope you enjoy it.
Are we ready? Okay. Can everybody hear me? Can y'all hear me back there?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all for coming. You know, when I was asked to present this program, I didn't know that it would snowball like it did, and I thought, it's not just about my ranch. I wanted all the branches to come together to form the tree for these brothers. I mean, they did so much for this community when they landed here in like 1891. And some descendants are still here today, which George Watkins is one of them, never left. So it's really important to recognize them and their contributions to this community. We don't have them all. We've got information we've gotten from old newspaper clippings, from family records, and from local historians and people who have lived here all of their life and remember these people and have lived life with them, And so I felt like it was really important to pull that all in together. So with that being said, all the houses that we have cataloged so far that were built by the Marshall Brothers, at least one of them, whether it was George and John, Will, all, they all sometimes chipped in together. They're all here. Not all of them are listed here. And so Pam and I are in the process of cataloging all the houses and buildings that they built, and we're going to put it into a catalog, a small book, to where, people can go around and see what, the houses that they built were, which were mainly Queen Anne and craftsman style. So they were their own architects most of the time. All right, so, the Marshall Brothers, architects, Boatwrights, and pillars of the community. George Watkins, and Ken Tucker were they just pulled out so much information, and so there's a lot tucked into this. Typically, I was told, you don't put so much information in a PowerPoint for this, and I'm like, well, this is genealogy. And so I wanted to do that because it's something that folks here want to see when they can look back on it. It's going to go on the YouTube video, and you can see all this, and you can document it for what it is. So Ken Tucker is we're going to be both presenting this for the different screens for the information that we have. He's from the John Marshall line, who was the oldest son. And so you'll hear from both of us as we go along. We'll have questions and answers at the end. And all the marshals that are here, please stay, because at the end, we're going to get a full picture of all of us out in the courtyard of the Rainey House, okay? It's really important to document this. All right? All right.
I just want to add that if you have any questions, comments, or reminiscence, wait till we get through all the slides. We have a total of about 60, so we'll get to that first.
Yes, and we also have a pad that is being passed around. We need emails because, you know, we need more information and more stories and all that good stuff too. And don't think it may not be important because it might be. Okay? All right. Let's start. Let's begin. All right, so the Marshall family, John Marshall was from Fayal, Azores, into Portugal. Then he married Wilhelma, who ended up being Minnie. She was from Germany, Prussia at the time. She was a little girl when she came over to Baltimore. And then they had, you can't really see, but they had Frank, John, George, William, Ida, Emma, and Richard.
Mr. Tucker.
All right. Now, well, this is the family tree. These are their children.
Donia, can we get Mr. Tucker to sit down? People back here can't see the screen. Thank you.
Can you see it here? All right, next slide. All right, so John, he was a Quaker Portuguese sailor, son of Francisco and Maria Marshalo or Machado, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I just saw this Marshallo name. We were always told by John Marshall Sr. of Apalachicola through Dwight Marshall that the family name was Machado. And it was named after a British sea captain whose name was Marshall. But here it is in writing. We have this Marshallo on a Quaker record book, 1861, up in Baltimore. Now, there's still a possibility it started out as Machado and they migrated over to Marshallo and then Marshall. We've still got some digging to do over that. So, but for the moment, the record says Marshallo is the last name.
Yeah, and that's typically what they used to do, even with Lindhoff. You know, Minnie's name was, well, when we go up, we'll see that the two spellings are different as they go on. So, next slide. All right, so the events of John Marshall is interesting. So Portuguese customs at the time dictated that the first son received family property, the second son was destined for the military, and the third son was dedicated to the priesthood. And having no desire to be a priest, John Marshall left home at age 10 with his older brother and shipped out as a cabin boy on a whaling ship. So, and he was there until he was on that ship or owned ships until he was 21 years old. So he traveled all over the world. He entered the U.S. through the port of Delaware at age 18 in 1838. He became a citizen in Philadelphia in 1853 and later married his first wife there who died, and then he moved to Baltimore, Maryland. He was under joined the U.S. Navy in 1853, serving under Commodore Perry, and when Perry sailed into Yedo Bay, Japan, he went to Africa and was encountered by cannibals, and we have discovered a letter from one of his sons that's telling a little bit more of the story of that little adventure that he went through. He married Minnie Lenoff, They resided in Baltimore and raised 5 sons and 2 daughters. In 1880, the love of the sea, spanning 30 years, he was a schooner captain and oysterman. He worked in a canning factory, Yale Lock Company, and was a church janitor at the end. He lost everything. They don't know why he lost everything. He lost his schooner, all of it. So he died in February 1885 of malaria and bronchitis, and he's buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Baltimore, which at the time was the premier. Methodist bishops are all buried there. It was prominent back then. What's interesting here is that he and we've got a letter here, he started keeping oystermen's and fishermen's money because they couldn't get to the bank. And we'll tell more about that later because it was interesting how the foundation of him with his ethics and his workmanship really carried on into his sons, I think. And that's why they had the characters that they had along with their mom.
A little louder, Donia.
Okay, he was a blockade runner, smuggling supplies past the Union blockade in Savannah, Georgia as well.
And I've got an ongoing research effort with the National Archives about that Commodore Perry visit to Japan. They've identified the 4 ships, they've identified the crew on all of them, but it's not searchable. You have to show up or hire somebody. But I will eventually check those crews and look for John Marshall, but really just as important to see what name he tried to come back in. And maybe that'll answer the question of what the last name was.
Sure. All right, next slide. All right, and so this is Minnie Plymouth Marshall. This is who he married. And she came over from Germany when she was 4 years old. And she was raised by her aunt and uncle. The story is that the only thing she remembers from her time in Germany were stone steps. Seeing stone steps going up to her house. So she was a really strong woman, and we'll show more about her as we go. Next slide. All right, so after John Marshall's death, Minnie remarried twice. First to Captain Ballard, whose ship is right here. He ran opium for medicinal purposes from the quarries. For medicinal purposes. And he was lost at sea. The boat sunk, and one of our cousins has this painting, and it's hand carved. She has it in her house. And Minnie's third marriage was to J.S. Funk, who she termed Dearie. And they lived in Lake City for 42 years, where they owned a city block on which they built a small church for the poor. And they're both buried in Lake City. All right, next slide.
Okay, here this explains that John and George Marshall first came to Florida. They acquired a photography business and a small merry-go-round, which they toured from Jacksonville to Pensacola, selling rides and photos. They later traded that for a schooner that hauled freight all over as far as Key West, and then returning with buttonwood, from which buttons were made here in Apalachicola. John first actually moved to Apalachicola to work for a contractor. At the time, George worked for the railroad out of Milton, Florida, where he met his wife, Miss Newman. Newman was her last name. But then eventually George came and started his contracting work in Apalachicola, followed in the 1890s by Will, Frank, and Richard. Then the brothers, principally George and John, began building the Queen Anne style and Craftsman style bungalow homes that we're going to have the pictures of later. Next slide.
All right, so this photo, this letter was acquired. My grandmama had it, And we just recently found it, and it was from Frank to Frank and Catherine, his son. All right, and so this was from Miriam Hempel, who was from Columbia, Missouri. And she sent it to my grandma in 1984. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because some of it's not, we don't need to know it. All right, so this is from Allenstown, Bimini, April 28, 1943. Dear Frank and Catherine, your letter of April 7th received the morning of the 27th, just 20 days coming from St. Augustine. Laid in Nassau 14 days, long enough to go around the world. Well, we are all well, but sure hungry for a good square meal. All we got here is fish and rice and fish. Potatoes, 15 pounds of cabbage, canned milk, sugar, coffee, butter, salt, beef, and pork. You are lucky. Tennis shoes, 14 and 16 shillings. Shoes, like we got for $3.50 to $4.50, now $7 to $9. Clothes, double price. Well, the weather's getting warm, that one's good. Now some of the family history. Your grandfather, John Marshall, was born on the island of Fayal, Azore Islands, and ran away from home with his eldest brother at 10 years old. Shipped as a cabin boy on a whaling ship, followed until 21 years of age and came to the U.S. Was with Commander Matthew Colbert Perry, but Perry sailed into Yedo Bay on July 8, 1853. See Reader's Digest, May 1942. After leaving Japan, went to the coast of Africa and landed someplace to get fresh water. He described Perry as a big man of about 200 pounds, and they went ashore armed and was met by cannibals. The chief was a big man, nearly 7 foot, with arms like watermelons, and after some talk, the chief and the natives grabbed Perry and started to the woods like Perry was a baby. They had to cut him to pieces and could not use guns and kill half the party of the natives before leaving Africa. They had a big war canoe. They had 100 rowers. Was going to bring to Washington, but on the way home, we ran into a hurricane and it broke loose on deck, and they had to turn it loose to save the ship. Would like for you to see if you can get the life of Perry, as there's lots of things he used to talk about. Just think your brother was in Africa, your cousin Herbert too. You are in the Coast Guard, George was in Panama, so you never need be ashamed of being a marshal. I was in the Spanish War Naval Reserve. Your grandfather was boatswain and mate and captain. And well, son, do not think that we will ever see each other again, as I am going 81. I'll remember you and Catherine, and proud of my family and to be an American. So that shows you the civic community, you know, that his sons, you know, carried over, and how the son here was proud to be an American because their dad came over, and they were freshly immigrants, right? It was the second generation, so they were proud to be American. All right, next slide.
Okay, this is John Thomas Marshall Sr. of Apalachicola. This is the son of the Portuguese John Marshall. And he's on the left. This is his home here in Apalachicola. Unfortunately, they burned it around 2010. This was his wife here, Maud Smith. I have pictures of this home out on that table if you missed it. This picture you can see much clearer out there, plus another one. But anyway, he was at least the big half of this partnership here. He was partly a builder, but he basically did woodwork. He had these really high-end, for the time, saws. This is the only word I can think of. It's a technical word, I'm sure. They were still there. They're only a couple of blocks from here, over there behind Weavings, but they were all in that same building that's there. And they cut up like spindles and these porch railings, all this kind of stuff that you have to order from Atlanta these days, but it was made here locally by John. And of course, he helped George in building a lot of these houses. But he was in about everything, so next slide. First one on the upper left here, Marshall Motor Boat Company. That was found this last fall in the Marks Marshall home at 66 Avenue D when they were doing now this home is antebellum, so it was not built by the Marshalls. Anyway, John Marshall Jr. and his wife and their kids lived here. So we believe that either John Marshall Sr. or John Marshall Jr. engaged in a repair and used one of the boat company pieces of wood, which I should have here if you want to look at it closer. I believe that it was John Marshall's company here that's responsible for this and operated this boat company, and we're going to show some pictures of that later. Bottom left is the National Marble and Granite Monuments, John Marshall Sr., local representative. This, of course, is the cemetery type monuments. Newman Marshall picked up this activity, which we'll talk about later. This is really an advertisement, which is 1910 penny inside and a mirror on the other side. And I have it over here on the table to look at later. But anyway, it tells about some of his woodwork, doing wire screens, sashes, doors, that kind of specialty woodwork of all kinds. And when you was able to go into that building in the 1950s, there was incredible saws in here, doing all kind of work. And my grandfather, Dwight Marshall, picked up that business and operated it from that store. Next slide. This is John Marshall's beach cottage. It's around 9th Street on the bay side, 9th and Pine. This picture was, it was built in 1909. This picture was taken in the early 70s, and it was long since collapsed. Interesting, I see this kind of house over on St. George now. I don't know what they call it, a West Indian or Bahama or something. But it's got that long overhanging porch, and you can walk around porches, so there's a lot of shade there. And they had an ice storage facility in the bottom, they would haul in ice. And this is about the location on the right of that home. And it's actually a deep water access there. If you're familiar with the bay side of St. George, there's sort of an inland underground river that comes almost up to the shoreline with 3 or 4 feet of depth. Otherwise, you go out 200 yards and you're in 2 feet of water along the bay side of St. George. Anyway, that house, they would spend the summer, most of the summer over there, the family was John Marshall's family. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is John Marshall's Empress. We believe that he built this, but we're not sure. Well, we do know that it started out as 39 feet. We have documented that John Marshall added 10 feet, so it became a 49-foot vessel. And it slept 10, and it was really for charter trips as far as Tampa and New Orleans, and a lot of day and weekend trips to St. George Island. John Marshall commuted to it in the summers. You can't see it in this picture too well, but I have the original out on the table, and you can easily see John Marshall on the right with the pipe. George Marshall is sort of in the center. Unfortunately, he's still in the shadows. Also, this boat was written about in Outpost on the Gulf, where they talked about taking people over, and Popham, the guy that the first development of St. George, chartered it to haul people over to try to sell lots. It's also included in a book I have on the table outside. which is a very interesting book. It's about the steamship or steamboat trade on the Apalachicola River system. It also mentions the emperors too. It's got a good picture of George Marshall's boat on there too, which I've got open. So stop by and look at that. Next slide. Okay, this is some more Marshall boats. This is Dwight Marshall Sr. in his last boat that he had before he died, a speedboat. This is his boat called the Buccaneer on the right, and that he used for a bay boat and for recreational purposes. To my knowledge, he never used it for commercial purposes. There is a book on the sale in Apalachicola, which I have a copy here. You'll see it, I'm sure. It misidentifies his boat as belonging to Bob Nedley. It's incorrect. It's his boat is on the right. Next slide. This is a listing that Dwight Marshall prepared of the various boats that he owned, his father owned, or his father owned with Will Marshall, John Marshall Jr., and other folks in Apalachicola. I'm not going to read them, but it's a total of 14 boats, and they were big time boaters. Starting out with sailboats, moving into motorboats, and the last one you saw a slide or two ago, the actual speedboat, which is not listed here. Next slide.
All right, so this is City Hall, and John Marshall built this building in 1903, and we received information from that from a newspaper article, May 9th, 1903. I didn't know it. I just found this out about 3 weeks ago, so I thought it was a real good treat, to see that and to know that John had a hand in erecting it. And that's on Water Street. All right, next slide.
Okay, now we go to the next generation. This is John Marshall Jr., John Marshall Sr.'s son. And this is a picture of him in his Army sergeant uniform. So he was a sergeant in World War I. He later came back, of course. I think he did not see combat. He got over there kind of late for that World War I. But anyway, he became a captain and commander of the local Company E, Corps of Engineers at Fort Combs. Being captain there means he was the ranking officer, so he was in charge of that for 28 to 29. So city engineer, city of Apalachicola, 25 to 29. And unfortunately, he died on duty as a city engineer after a storm event. I think he stepped in a puddle with a live wire or stepped on a live wire. His another son, Dwight Marshall Sr., my grandfather, he was very active in the community, county commissioner, school board member, city commissioner, Mason for about 50 years. But he picked up John Marshall Sr.'s woodwork. He started out doing that specialty wood cutting, trimming. But things migrated to Atlanta, the Home Depot, whatnot. So he basically moved over to building supplies and also ran a hardware store in town. He was big in co-founding, and a longtime officer and director of that Citizens Federal Savings Bank of Fort St. Joe, which through various mergers, acquisitions, and reorganizations is now part of Cadence Bank out of Alabama.
And,
next slide.
This is what's interesting about this. All right, so Dwight Marshall Sr. Did this with the banking. So John Marshall from Baltimore, okay, very quickly, he was known as an honest man and employed. This is off of the encyclopedia. This is Providence Bank up in Baltimore. John Marshall, known for his honesty and employed as a janitor in Baltimore's Friends Gospel Mission, began to keep money of his friends under his watch while they were at sea. Banks were plentiful enough, but at the time they were clustered in the city's business center far from the docks where the sailors lived and departed on their voyages. Moreover, the banks were only open from 10 to 1 and sailors were not known to keep banquet hours. Also, the banks had very little interest in catering to small sailors. Because Marshall was reliable, the demand for his help escalated. And after 2 years, he decided it was time to make the service more formal, and he enlisted the help of the mission's 2 volunteer managers, foundry owner John Carey and attorney James Carey Jr. They set up shop in the mission's reading room every Saturday night to collect the savings of the men, which totaled just $11.55 in change the first night. And then on Monday morning, one of them would deposit the funds in one of Baltimore's regular banks. Carey and Carey soon decided to take the idea one step further, and with the help of area businessman turned Marshall's favor for friends into a bank, one that catered to the sailors and fishermen in their communities. And then in 1886, they received a charter from Maryland legislature for the Providence Savings Bank of Baltimore, which began doing business in March 1886. So, you know, by the end of 1800s, Providence boasted $1.3 million in deposits, which was just unheard of at that time. But it was because John Marshall was trustworthy. You know, and everybody trusted him to take care of their money because they were hardworking people, you know. So I thought that was interesting that kind of carried over.
Yeah, and by the way, this bottom right picture of the white Marshall is about 1940. Next slide. And here is the grandson now. We're going down to the next slide. Grandson of John Marshall Sr., Dwight Marshall Jr. He was in the Army 1944 to 46. He was mayor of Apalachicola and county commissioner. But he probably his biggest claim to fame, he founded Anchor Realty on St. George Island, co-founded it. That still operates big time on the island. I saw it just the other day in Tallahassee. I don't know where else it is, but it's still very active. Next slide. Okay, now, Little Big Marshall. He was a sergeant back in World War II, but he was stationed in Hawaii. He, of course, grew up in Apalachicola, but he, after a career as an architect in the Boston area, he came back and moved to Apalachicola. He's the one that developed the studies that produced the restoration and preservation plans. But I was around when he did this, and I can tell you this, he did it all for free. It was so totally his idea. He went to the city commission, the planning commission, and said, listen, you've got a real asset here with these historic homes. They can help this town through economic, be your key to economic development. This was back when things were pretty bad too. There wasn't that much of a tourist industry here. St. George and all. This is how you do it. These are the grants. I can help you apply for them. I can perform these studies, and they will highlight to the state, to the world, the significance of these historic structures. So sure enough, he was able to get all kinds of grants from the state to develop these studies that in turn produce the plans to preserve these structures and identify them. You know, the first step is to identify. What that did, it did several things. One, the city eventually adopted land use regulations to preserve, protect these historic homes and businesses. And that means that in order to modify them, you have to get a permit. Or if there's new construction in the area, you've got to be specially permitted. But what it did, it brought to the community the recognition that these homes were worth something after all. In the past, they kind of were falling down in the early 70s. But now with the grant, the notoriety, the new land use regulations, people started not only maintaining, but redoing these old homes and getting them in shape for the kind of tourist industry that we see here today. So we can thank George Marshall and to a lesser extent John Marshall for constructing most of these. We really got to, shake his hand for making sure that the community recognizes their value and to make sure that they're properly preserved, advertised, and protected.
Ken, may I add, this is Marie Marshall, Willoughby's widow. In 1975, when he proposed this to the city fathers, they sent him packing back to Cambridge. They thought he was out of his mind because things looked like sticks and stones. And then when we came to Florida, he was able to work on it intensively, but yet he died believing in the town.
Next slide. Okay, this is Vivian Marshall, another granddaughter. She grew up here in Apalachicola, and she ended up being the author of the biography on John Gorey, and it's just entered in a second edition, and I saw it's for sale out here, and I think it's for sale all over town. Next slide. Okay, this, again, here's the lady that he met in Milton while he was working for the railroad.
Yes, and so this is the George Marshall home. They had 4 children, Bessie, Herbert, Rudolph, and Newman. And George did most of the building. His house still stands. In fact, this is a recent picture. Right, next. All right, so this is one of George Marshall's sons, Rudolph Marshall, and we have relatives here today from his line, from Pensacola, who co-built most boats of the Marshall Brothers companies in Appalachia, and he also built submarine chasers for the U.S. Navy in Texas during World War II. This house is still standing at 169 Avenue B. It's across from Lafayette Park. He had a candy store back there behind his house that he sold candy and just small-time groceries in.
The book I mentioned, Outpost on the Gulf, which I have a copy here, also talks about Rudolph's boats. He built, this was back in the 1920s, a speedboat for the Rice brothers that had a 200 horsepower airplane engine in it. Then he built another one for Mr. Popham with a 90 horsepower airplane engine in it. And he would typically run races on the 4th of July with his speedboats here in Apalachicola. Now, when he moved to Pensacola, he specialized in cabin cruisers. We're going to show you some pictures of those. But he also participated in racing speedboats in Pensacola very prominently. Next slide. Here he is, Rudolph and his workers in Pensacola. Next slide. Rudolph's boat works in Pensacola. Some of his crew. Next slide. Now these are really some high-class cabin cruisers. Quite a bit more elegant than what he built in Apalachicola. Next slide.
Quality boats.
Yeah. Next slide.
This just tells a newspaper article about when he opened his boat building business in Pensacola. Next slide.
That's a very nice, very specialized vessel. Next slide. This is the interior.
Next slide.
Okay, here's the next son, Newman Marshall. Now, he was an Army sergeant in the late 30s and early 40s, again at Fort Coons. I was told that the local draft board would not let him go to World War II because he was in such demand for construction work, particularly concrete work. And he did specialize in monuments that I talked about, concrete, sidewalks, streets and whatnot, and all kinds of construction, including homes throughout the county. He was fire chief here for 50 plus years and an actual fireman for about 75 years. And the fire station is now named the Newman Marshall Fire Station.
And it's right on 98 across from the Hickory grocery store. And there's the original fire engine bell that came with the LeBron fire truck, and he's the one who took it off the ribbon club.
Next slide. Okay, now, here's a resume for you. Herbert Marshall. He signed up as a seaman in the U.S. Navy in World War I. He came back, he worked for the State Road Department for a while, but then he eventually rejoined the Army, became a captain in 1939, and again he became the commander of Fort Coons. And my mother said that he took that whole company over to World War II to fight in the war. He came out of the war as a major. Next, he was elected sheriff for 4 terms, I believe. That would be 16 years, 52 to 68. And he and his wife ended up owning Little St. George. And he built a home there in the 1940s. The state purchased Little St. George in 1977. The state restored that old home. And I think many of the family members stayed over there. I know we did. We spent at least a week over there with him on that
And this is his home, built in 1927, and it is Avenue B. Next slide. All right, now this is George Marshall Watkins, and this is Newman's grandson. And George is in the audience today. He's lifelong Apalachicola born. His father was Richard Watkins, mother was Mary Joyce Marshall. He has been known in the area for being a shrimper, net fisherman, crabber, flounder and oyster. He worked with, concrete with his granddad, and he has been a beekeeper, which everybody knows George has been a Tupelo beekeeper. He takes his barges for years. He's been going up the Apalachicola River and harvesting Tupelo honey. And he works for the state of Florida for the last 25 years. So he's in the audience. He's a great one to talk to.
Where is George?
He's George. All right, next slide. All right, so this is the Marshall House. This is a field station. This was Herbert's and Pearl's house. It's still standing today. You can go there by boat. They have trails through the island. You can see interpretation that they have for the barn. They're redoing George says that they're redoing the roof soon. We've got the rear view of the house and the front view of the house. And it's on the historical register, and it is a true flood cracker house. And my mom as well remembers going over and spending the week with Alice and her cousins with Uncle Herbert and Pearl during the summer times. And if you've not been over there, it really is. It's just it's old as Florida, for sure.
Yeah, it's solar powered now.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Okay, so these are the houses, and these were the first houses that were built by the Marshall brothers. So, you have the Margaret King House, which is at Lafayette Park, the Trinity Episcopal Rectory, and then the Buck Hayes House, which is now part of the Gibson Inn complex, right there on the corner of Avenue D. It was built by George. All right, next slide. Then we have the Coons House that was built in 1905 for James Coons. We have the house next door to the Coons House that was built by George, and then the Fletcher House that was built by George in 1908. So he was busy.
And that book, Outpost on the Gulf, quotes the Apalachicola Times, saying that this Coombs house was the most elegant house in Apalachicola.
Next slide. Okay, we have to the left, the postmaster Farley's house, which is where that granite, John Marshall sign, I found that in the yard sale at the bottom of a bunch of catalogs for $5, which I feel was a great find. And then we have Dr. Williams' house here, and then the Toronto house, which is another part of the Gibson and Complex that has been moved, that's right there at the bridge as you come into Apalachicola, and I think that's a Airbnb maybe or something like that, but they redone that house. All right, the Hickey house, which is on Highway 98, looking over the water near the Ace Hardware store. Then you have the Teague house, and we have the Wheating house on Avenue C, which was built by George. Okay, the H.D. Marks house, and this is also owned by Trinity Episcopal Church, and it's Pennyworth, the thrift store on Highway 98. All right, next slide. Then we have the Wakefield house on Avenue C and the Marshall Porter house that was built in the 1800s, but it caught on fire, and George rebuilt a lot of it. All right, next slide. All right, to the businesses, you have St. Paul A&E Church, it's on the hill on Avenue I. George was a foreman, but Ezekiel Waltman, who was an African-American, was the laborer. He's the one who ran it, and they built the church. And it took a few years to do it, but it's a very nice church that still stands, and it is a great structure. And then you have the First United Methodist Church that's on 5th Street in 98, as well as Mount Zion that's on 98. The interesting thing here is if you go by this church, you can't really see it here in this photo, but they cast concrete blocks to make them look like rock. And so, they were really skilled in forming concrete, as you will see when we get to the Chapman Auditorium. All right, next slide. All right, we have the Billy Buzzard house on Bay Avenue, the Williams Coming on Bay, and then Avenue C. This was wood that was built that survived the fire at Herbert Marshall's house that was next door. They had the whole block, and so they just put part of it over there and made another structure from it. Next slide. And then you have some more. Newman built this house to the left, and Dwight built this house on Highway 98. And you can see, when you see these through Apalachicola, these concrete foundations here, through here, you know that, they did the cement work. That's their signature. All right, next one. George built Benedict Hall for Trinity Episcopal Church. He also built the Cook Building at Market Street, which was Tamaro's for a long time. And here is the pet store on oyster bones, and as you can see, it's still the telltale sign of a cement block, just like the church. They used to build foundations and stuff as well and use that technique. All right, so this is the building that's at Avenue E and Market Street. They built this structure, and look at the stained glass. The stained glass throughout. This is all iron. Just beautiful work for that time period too. And they built the Dixie Theater, which is right beside the building that we just saw. 1912. Next slide. These are some of the features of the Dixie Theater. Of course, the gargoyles, 2 gargoyles, the ticket box. Just, the details are beautiful. And then we come to the Chapman Auditorium. Now, with this was built in 1932. George wasn't the original builder. They had an architect come in. They had hired a builder from Fort St. Joe, but he went bankrupt, and it was taking so long. And so they hired George to finish the project. And this is all cast cement. And so, you know, when you look, I mean, look at this, how they formed and made all these architectural designs in the cement. I think they need to do something about doors. The doors need to have something done to them, I would say, because this is a beautiful, when they built this, in the newspaper, it said that it was the finest piece of building architecture in Florida, in the state of Florida at the time. You know, so it really does need to be preserved. All right, next slide. So if you look, look at the apple and the scallops, you know, and the exterior border with crabs in them. You know, it's just beautiful work. The inside with the pelicans and the staircase, yeah, it's almost, I mean, yeah, it was the late 20s, early 30s, but it has a Masonic feel to it too. I mean, seriously. You know, you've got the stars above, the arched doorways going in to the theater. Next slide. And then this is the interior. And they're fixing to take all of these out and replace them with new stuff. But that's another day. So, you know, look at that. I mean, it's just, it almost has an Egyptian feel to it. You know? And these are recent pictures. So it's been well maintained for the interior. All right, and this is the cement company that George had. Lehigh Cement first, Alpha Cement. This is the church that we were talking about, 1917, the cast concrete block with a rusticated finish is what they called it. All right, and then this is my great-grandfather, William Leonard Marshall, who married Grace Fenton Tiller from Tallahassee. Right, and he followed his brothers here in Apalachicola. She had lived in a house in Tallahassee that looked like this house. And he said, well, I'll build you a house that, you know, that you like if you live in Appalachia. So he built her a house and moved down here, lived for a couple of years, I think 3 years, had their first son and she missed home. And so they left and went back to Tallahassee, where he was a high priest mason, Kiwanis Covenant for 25 years. He was mayor of Tallahassee from 1932 to 1933. He was on St. John's Episcopal Church board for 26 years, a junior ward, and put in the altar, put in the bell tower, so, you know, very instrumental in the civic duties in Tallahassee as well. All right, next. Okay, so this is interesting. The reason I put this in here, this was Grace Miller's house that she grew up in, that was born. She was born in at Call and Calhoun Streets in Tallahassee, right downtown. He built this house for her, you know, he wanted her to feel comfortable being here. That house, her prior house, the one on the left, burned in 1904. But that just shows how much he loved her, you know. All right, next slide. All right, now Will also was a furniture maker. And this is a chair that he built for my grandmama, Eliza, and dog furniture. And they were Christmas gifts one year. I think she was 4 years old, took for her dogs, which we still have. In fact, this furniture and these dolls are on display upstairs in the Rainey House. They have been taken care of them upstairs in the Rainey House. So, next. All right, and then these are Will and Grace's children. To the left is Bill, then this is Lena, Eliza, my grandmama, and Addison Marshall. And that's on the front steps of their house. And this is Will and Grace's family. So they have a large family. All right, and this was all, they take these pictures on Christmas Day, from what I understand. Okay, and this was Will and John and the Grace. They built this, it's called the Grace. And then they sold it, and from what I understand, they sold it to a couple of guys, they were taking it out the West Pass, and there was a storm and a sun. And so it's still at the bottom of West Pass. And this is my grandmama, right here, crossing over on the ferry, coming from East Point to Apalachicola. And I'm not sure which one is which, but she grew up with what we call, so we were called the governor of Florida. Right there, because he was from Tallahassee, and we went to church together. And I don't know if it was him or him, but it was one of the two.
It's the first hymn.
The first one?
Yes.
This one right here?
Yes.
Okay, so here's your governor. All right, that's all right, so they had two, John Marshall and not mine, I had two daughters. You know, just because she died, I still want to be able to recognize her as part of the family. So she died at birth, as far as we know her. And she's the only one that's buried with her daddy in that huge family cemetery plot up in Baltimore. All right, and this was Emma Marshall. She came down to Lake City with Minnie. When Minnie married Mr. Funk. She was married and she died in childbirth. And so after that, there were no more daughters in the family, all males. Now there's Richard Marshall, the youngest. He married Nellie Irene and then Lillian Elizabeth here in Appalachia. And we don't know much about him. He had children, Louise and Betty, but if you all know more about him, please let us know, because we want to find more about him. Okay? That's it.
That is Marshall Williams.